Okay, thanks for taking just a minute to talk about high cash rents with me. It's certainly a topic that is not a surprising thing that we need to talk about and think about as we start to make some adjustments. And I just put this this 10-year, 11-year trend of net farm income up here just to kind of remind everybody why this has become such a big issue. But certainly in those time periods of 2009 to 2012, we were seeing cash rent prices skyrocket as people were doing whatever they could to get a hold of new ground. And now that we're seeing that profitability of the operations drop off, we're understandably needing to see some cost reduction in order to keep average net farm incomes from going negative. So if we look at cash rent trend, this is irrigated corn cash rent per acre, again, for farms in Nebraska, all across the state. But 2006, our average cash rent was about $112 an acre. 2015, just 10 years later, is $238 an acre. So it's obviously a very significant increase. A lot of people look at these numbers and go, cash rent can't be this low. Got weird numbers because everybody's paying a lot. It's important to remember that we're looking at actual farm costs from producers that we work with all across the state. So there's certainly some differences in the demographics of where we're at. But there's also, a lot of reasonable cash rents that are still out there, and but nobody talks about those because they wouldn't be their rents for long if they sat around and talked about how they were renting ground for $200 an acre next to the neighbor who was renting it for $400 an acre. So I think both of those things are important, is that not everybody was paying high rents through all of this. But you can certainly see, again, from about that 2009 to 2013 where we had those high escalations of prices, and we've seen some back off since then. The other thing I think it's important to understand here is that in our averages, we do have some rents that are on a bushel basis, and so in our system we have to call them cash rent and give them a price of the amount of bushels that they gave up times their average marketing price for the year. And so that's certainly one of the things that has fallen to contribute to that drop since 2013. If we look at irrigated corn cost of production for 2015, the last year we have data, direct costs other than cash rent, so those are seed, fertilizer, chemicals, irrigation costs, operating interest, those sorts of direct things, amounted to about $458, or about 58% of your total farm costs. Cash rent, again, was the average at $237. That was 30% of the total costs. And then the overhead costs, your insurance, depreciation, and those kinds of costs are kind of be there whether you farm that or not, would be another 12%, just to kind of get an idea. And again, thinking back, if you were one of those producers that got into some higher rents, so the $300, $400, maybe even $500 per acre leases, you're probably looking at that cash rent cost being even more than 30% of your total costs. Anytime we're talking about cash rent, we also need to talk about real estate and personal property tax trend. The real estate taxes have certainly been going up as well, doubling in that same time period. But again, remembering that $33 an acre is not the same amount that the cash rent went up. Now, every producer, every landlord is in the same boat here, but we do need to keep in mind that even though we do know that taxes are going up, and they're going to continue to go up until we start to see property valuations come back down, that this is really a two-sided story. We certainly have all of our costs and falling commodity prices from a tenant perspective, but we also have rising costs from a landlord perspective. So we don't want to make sure that we don't leave that part of this conversation out as we're going through this. So what do we do? I think it's important that we find a balance for this, because in the long run, we need to have both the landlord and the tenant making money, and they need to be able to trust each other, and that's where communication really becomes very important. From the landlord, we know they've got those rising fixed costs and the property taxes, but they're also dealing with a lot of rumors and actual bidding wars that are out there. And I hear from a lot of the landlords that I work with, well, everybody's getting $400 an acre, and that's not true. And it's not sustainable either, and that's the tough part. From a tenant standpoint, we're certainly dealing with falling commodity prices and that squeeze between what's rumor and what's reality, to where what we're hearing at the coffee shop and what we're hearing on the news and what we're hearing through a lot of publications is high cash rent. And then we've got to find that happy place in between there. One thing that I think is important that tenants understand, though, is that if we communicate with landlords in the bad times and tell them how rough we have it now, we also have to be willing to communicate with landlords in the good times when things turn around, because there will be times when we have good profitability, and maybe not as long-term as what we experienced the last 10 years. But coming up with some sort of plan that works for both, and that communication becomes open, so that we don't have the situation of the tenants telling them how bad it is and the landlord not being able to trust them because they're only sharing in the bad times. So if we wanted to put a little bit of economics to work here, and from a tenant perspective on if we cannot make that communication thing work, if we cannot come up to an agreement that works for everyone with the landlord, when do we start to make those hard choices? And there's some basic economic laws that we can look to in when we should stop farming that ground. When should we give up that piece of property? And anytime income's negative, we've got to be looking at the options, but not necessarily a negative net return shouldn't automatically be a sign that we're going to give up that ground. We need to look at the economics that's in the short run and the economics of the long run, and how those things work together. So we need to think about 3 different categories of expenses. Those direct expenses, like I said, were seed, fertilizer, chemicals, cash rent, all those things that would go away if you didn't farm that particular piece of ground. So your seed bill would definitely go down if your acres decreased. Overhead expenses are something that would stay the same regardless. So your farm insurance would probably not be any less, your blanket policy, if you were short 80 acres. So that would be an overhead expense. And then we have our non-farm costs that we have to think about too. So family living expenses, income taxes, those kinds of non-farm costs that we're still expecting income from the farm to cover. Ideally, and in the long term, we need gross income to be bigger than all 3 of those. When gross income is bigger than all 3 of those, we are generating a profit and having a positive net worth change. But that's not the case that most producers are operating in today. So we need to look a little deeper. If we look at having gross income that covers all of our farm costs, our direct expenses and our overhead costs, then we're still in a good place because there's some income being contributed to those other things. We can look at solutions like cutting non-farm expenses, maybe increasing non-farm income to help pay for those non-farm expenses, or we can maybe even be considering using some of prior years' profits to subsidize these low years. It's going to be reducing net worth, but again, if your financial statement is in a strong position, that's something that we can look at as an option to get through a short period of times when our gross income meets our farm expenses but not our non-farm expenses. So then the next step is if our gross income is bigger than our direct expenses but doesn't cover all of our overhead expenses, do we still want to continue farming that piece of ground? The economics says yes, we want to continue to do that. If we're getting enough income to pay for all those inputs, the seed and fertilizer and chemicals and cash rent, and have something contributing to the overhead, the insurance, the depreciation, the long-term interest, those sorts of things that aren't going to go away if you don't farm that, we're still better off because something is being contributed to those. Okay, so we're putting something towards those, that's better than nothing. Okay. So if we're at that point where gross income covers directs but not all of our farming expenses, that's okay. We want to continue. We're still better off to continue farming that in the short run. When we get to the point where gross income does not cover direct expenses, then economic law says we're better to let that piece of ground go. Okay, so if we have $3 corn and you're growing 200 bushel corn on that, $600 of gross income. If we're spending $400 on cash rent, and $100 on fertilizer, and $100 on seed, we have nothing left. We've used those 3 expenses to come up with all of our gross income for that. We haven't put any chemicals on it. We haven't put any crop insurance on it. We haven't irrigated it. at that point, we need to be starting to take a very tough look at whether or not we want to continue farming that. The inputs that you're putting into that 80 are taking all of the gross income and then some of your income from other places as well. So let's see if we can think about this a little bit bigger picture, though, because there's other things that we need to think about. Certainly, the opportunity to farm that piece of ground in the future. We know how rarely farm ground turns over. And so if you give it up and say, let somebody else have it, will you ever be able to get it back? And that's a real opportunity or thing that we need to think about. We also need to think about how much net worth can you stand to lose. And that depends on the position that you're in. We'll talk about that here more in just a second. The other thing that's important to think about is how much are we talking about? Is this 10% of your acres or 80% of your acres? Can we get by with this 10% or these large losses on a small amount of your operation? We can do that a lot longer than if we're talking about this being the majority of your operation. So let's take just a little bit look at some of the numbers. These again are 2015 costs. I just put a 200 bushel yield again, just to kind of give us an average yield, and threw in some family living and taxes. Again, average for the producers that we work with. So if we're going to give this an idea, if we're going to have enough to cover our direct costs, we need to have $3.67 corn. If we've got more than $3.67 per bushel, we keep going. Right? At $4.10, we're covering all of our farm costs, but not covering our family living. We need $4.76 in this example in order to keep things going in the long term. But this sort of fairly simple example, you can break down it if you put all your direct and overhead or your direct costs together, put your total farm costs together, and then your total costs. That'll give you an idea of at what point you need to be thinking about making some of these tough choices. Again, not very simple as just financial. We need to make sure we take a look at those longer things. So let's take a little bit look at that financial position. So this is a pie chart of our working capital for the producers coming into the 2016 year. So 24% of the farms that we have in our averages had negative working capital coming into this year. That means that they had more debts that they needed to pay in the next 12 months. Operating note, payments on term notes, those kinds of obligations that are going to come up in the next 12 months. They had more of that than they had assets that were going to be liquid this year, things that are going to sell. So cash, prepaids, and grain on hand or feeder livestock on hand. Those would be the kinds of assets we're talking about. Those operations are in a tough position. Overall, 32% were in the red. Okay, so when we talk about ratios, we always talk about the red light, green light, yellow light. So if you're green light, we're good to go. Yellow is caution. Red, we have a problem. 32% of the farms that we work with are in that red zone for working capital. 51% of the farms, on the other hand, are sitting in a good position. So that in the green area is sitting in a good position. So, and then within that, there's a total of 18% of the farms that are sitting with more than 80% working capital to gross revenue. That means they're providing more than 80% of their gross revenue from their own source rather than an operating note. So I think what's important to understand here is we have operations who are very dependent on banks and some that are not. We have operations that have cash and reserves still in a significant amount, and operations that aren't. And it's important to understand that, because if you're looking at this scenario and you're one of the 24% of the farms that have negative working capitals, the banks are not going to let you sit very long in a losing position before they say, we're done, we're not going to finance this anymore. On the other hand, if you're one of the 18% of the farms that are sitting with most of your working capital in cash or liquid reserves, such as grain to sell, you're going to be able to make that choice on your own, and you're going to be able to withstand those short-term losses longer than those 24% of the farms waiting for the turnaround in the economy to happen. Another way of looking at this would be capital debt repayment margin. This really just shows how much cash you have to pay your debts. Okay, so we're taking net farm income and non-farm income and family living expenses and taxes out, and looking at how much you have left, how much cash you're going to have left versus what you're going to have to pay. So all those term payments that you're going to have to make in the next year. And we've seen that flip to a negative position for the first time on average in 2015. And that's a big deal, because you can see I put the working capital trend on there too, and you can see the working capital to gross revenue trend has dropped from almost 50% on average to under 30% in just 4 years. So we very quickly lost working capital, and you can see what that's done to repayment margin and the fact that we've disappeared. On average, the ability to repay the debt that we have out there. And again, there's a wide range of variability amongst our operations, but if you're looking at sitting about average, the banks are going to start getting nervous. You're not going to have a lot of time to be making these kinds of decisions. So in general, we're talking about cash rents and high cash rents. We need to be communicating. We need to be talking with the landlords and making sure that we're coming up with a fair deal for everyone, because in the long term, both the landlord and the tenant need to be able to make money off of that ground in order for it to be a good relationship. We need to know what your costs are and your financial position and how that's different from average, how that's different from your neighbor, how that's different from even your father or your son. Okay, those things, everybody's costs are going to be different. And we need to know where you're at, because if we just keep going blindly, we're going to get in a position where you're not going to have the choice to make the decision. It's going to be made for you. And then we also need to consider those non-financial costs. We can put a lot of emphasis on numbers, but it's not the only answer. We do need to think about long-term decisions. How long can we go with creating those losses, and what can we do to offset that in the short term? Maybe we're looking at non-farm income. Maybe we're looking at a different enterprise in order to sustain that piece of ground in the long term, so we can get back into a profitable position, or potentially have the opportunity to buy it in the future. Those are all kinds of things that we need to think about. If you have any more questions, you can certainly contact us through our website, and we'd be happy to help you out. Thanks.